Archie and Friends, a Halloween Tale. This was mislabeled as an Archie and Friends story, so if I hadn't seen it on archive.org, I might have missed it. It's off-putting to see a live-action cropped picture of Salem's head from the sitcom, even if he's normally my favorite design for Salem. Sabrina's in a comic store to get the latest Sonic issues for Salem. She insists there are female friends in her enjoy comics too, but doesn't say which comics exactly, which would make her arguments more memorable. It's silly that of all the issues she could have been holding of Archie Sonic, she just had to show off one of the bad ones, the Exile superhero crossover. But still, she's sweet being so optimistic. She tells them to witness the comics pages in all of their glory, and then somehow she's surprised when she and him start warping to the comic, when she'd have to imagine that for it to happen, and that's not what her wording would have had her do. The guy with her wonders if she's a witch. That's refreshingly not stupid for a mortal in the series. It's sad that I have to compliment that. It would have been stupid if he thought he was just hallucinating. Salem narrates that Sabrina repeated one of his spells, and at least Lampshades, you'd think she'd know better. She was phrasing like that to try to sound cool and praise the comic, so I understand. Especially since she had no reason to think she could cast that kind of spell by accident, when nothing in the spell says anything about this. But putting the plot hole aside, I'm excited to see Sabrina finally get to experience the Sonic universe instead of the more boring other way around. He says that was awesome and wants to do it again. I like that more than I'm hating her. He's not so bad after all, and it's nice of her to help him up. How does Salem's narration not know what fantasy world she was reading about when he's a fan of Sonic comics? I guess that was phrased confusingly and he did. If he's narrating the story, he already knows everything that happened in it. He should have said, which would send you to a universe related to whatever comic you were holding. So, Sabrina's magic scanned reality to find a universe that was the closest match to the comic, and teleported her to the place that looked like the location in the panel. That's the only way it could make sense, because we all know comics don't have universes inside them. Sabrina says she'll be happy to get her and him home, because this place is filthy. But considering how interesting Mobius is, and the fact that she's a witch who can defend herself from anything, I can totally understand why she would get so distracted by what's around her that she wouldn't warp home instantly. Of course she'd want to see a bit more of the comic world if she's a fan of it. In fact, why couldn't that have been why she came here? Though it would be less unique and interesting if she didn't come here with a mortal, and that'd have to be by accident. It would be more exciting if this was Harvey, but only in theory, because in practice, Harvey at this point in the series would just freak out and be terrified of magic, like always. And it's creative to have him here instead. Then he wonders if they're filming Terminator 3, and points to Robotnik Prime instead of Robotnik. Which is confusing because the city's drawn like it was at the time of the Exiles crossover after he died, and they went into that issue. So how's he alive? Or here? It could make sense because this could be another Robotnik from Robotnik, who came to this universe to fight Sonic out of boredom just like he did. He tells Sonic to surrender and threatens Tails in a way that, while gruesome, takes advantage of him being an animal for once. I wish the Sonic series made a lot more use out of the fact that characters are specific animals. And he is evil, after all. Sabrina makes a remark that you'd think would cause Robotnik to look at her and bother her right away, because she's so close to him. And he would have noticed the guy by now because he talked a panel ago. Instead we see Knuckles and Sonic. And I have to assume Robotnik's talking to Sabrina while they're talking to each other, which would keep her too occupied to think to warp away. Sonic assumes Sabrina and the nerd are evil because they're humans, and thus associated with Eggman on this planet. I like that Sonic calls out Robotnik on being ugly. Sabrina has the common sense to immediately tell Knuckles she's not with them. I wish she said Robotnik instead. He's the only sentient villain there. Knuckles wonders how he's getting the feeling that she's nothing but trouble, which intimidates her. Since when is he able to detect witchcraft? Oh, well, to be fair, he can detect Master Emerald energy in the adventure games. Chaos energy is magic in its own right. I didn't catch on right away because it's associated with magical gems, not people called witches. And we don't see people using emeralds or chaos powers with most of the abilities that Sabrina has. Better yet, chaos energy is recessive for some reason. The only explanation for why Sonic is fast while his parents never are. So that's not comparable to witchcraft. And the adventure games hadn't happened yet, in both the comic, and they hadn't been released in real life yet. Nestle 1 wasn't released until September 1998. So the idea that Knuckles could sense and hunt down emerald shards wasn't used yet. But since it makes him a better guardian, it's easy to come up with that he can. I don't remember if Knuckles was established to have a chaos energy sensing power before the emeralds got shattered, but I've experienced the comic more than anybody, so I doubt it. So him detecting witchcraft and being intimidated can make sense, because his father made him to be more powerful to be a guardian that survives better. Sabrina says she'll leave in a moment, and I assumed she'd be prevented from going away, like by getting interrupted in her spell casting. But instead she says the whole spell and warps back home. Already? Oh, thank God, she took Sonic and Knuckles with her. She couldn't do that by accident. She'd have to imagine that happening. But still, I thought that'd be the end of her interaction with them, and that'd be lame. She could have been hit by Knuckles before she'd get to say another word. But that'd be out of character because he's not actually a violence-first hothead anymore at this point in the comic. Which is why I tried to find out where the Dingle Leader had his people protesting instead of attacking him and stop someone else from doing so. The only other option would be for her to get hit by a laser, but that'd injure or kill her, which would be too dark, and being hurt still wouldn't prevent her from warping home right afterwards anyways. And even if she stayed longer, I already know what Knothole and Mobotropolis are like, and if she stayed for longer, I'd wonder why she wasn't using magic against Robotnik. I was too focused on saying other things about the story to ask that right away, because she hadn't been there long enough. So that was the best way to handle her going there. Still, I'd have liked to see her explore Knothole. It'd work best if she didn't know about Robotnik, though. Sabrina says she's supposed to attend Cheryl's Halloween party, and even though she's supposed to be too nice if anything, she uncharacteristically acts like Sonic and Knuckles said nothing and just frets that she's not in costume. And why is she even having this guy go to the party with her when he was just a guy who acted like no girl bought comics for herself? Well, this is one of the only mortals who hasn't freaked out at her for using magic. So it makes sense that she'd spend more time with him as a friend to enjoy it until it gets bad. But it was forced that he asked how she summoned costumes for him and her when he already knows she has magic. I love that she's in a witch costume, but it should have been a black one to look cool and look like most of them, not a dreary gray one that she'd find unfashionable. Sonic reminds her that he and Knuckles are still here, and she tells him to relax and tag along while she figures this out. I have to assume that the reason she doesn't just warp them home is, well, there's two good reasons. One, she's always been a fan of his comic, so of course she'd just say this as a lame excuse to spend more time with him. And two, Cheryl was already driving towards her, so she couldn't warp them home where she'd see it. Yeah, but she should have seen her zap up the costumes if she was driving towards her, because that'd mean she was looking ahead. Where she was, of course. And she doesn't act like she saw her use magic when she greets her. I have to assume that she was busy looking at something to the left when she was driving towards her. Like a squirrel or a building. So she didn't see her in the magic smoke. She could have easily not been drawn already driving towards her. Sabrina could have simply remembered that she has her party to go to. Anyways, Sabrina lies that her cousin's babysitter came down with the flu, so she got stuck with her kids for the party guests, which is her clever excuse for why Sonic and Knuckles are here. I like that she had a smart lie and it takes advantage of their short heights. Still, the fact that they're not really in costumes would be given away in seconds anyways when they'd inevitably blink, because they weren't told to not blink when people are looking at them. But to be fair, Cheryl's only looking at Sabrina. Once the car arrived at Veronica's house, wait, why Veronica's house? Why would she invite Cheryl to her party when she hates her? Anyways, someone tells them they're just in time for the pig roast. For no reason. Sonic gets scared at hearing that because he's met two pig people before. But that's obviously stupid because chili dogs are made of pork anyways. The writer should have known that and assumed that there were always non-sentient pigs on Mobius that are considered fine to eat. Because Mutsky is a non-sentient animal, So that proves that not every animal species is sentient. What, did he think the chili dogs were vegan? I guess this is supposed to make sense because it's going off the fact that Sonic doesn't trust humans because the only humans he knew were Robotnik and Snibbly, and he considers Nate to be just an exception. Still, he didn't experience the Great War, so he still doesn't have the personal experience to see Overlanders as untrustworthy monsters who he'd instinctively think of as wanting to eat and throw people. He'd still give Nate a chance right away. Okay, I could understand Knuckles assuming that more because he met the hunter who hunted Mobians. Cheryl Lampshade said having a pig roast is gross at an outdoor party as Sonic and Knuckles are still there. I'm glad they didn't stay in the car hiding because that'd be cowardly. I guess it can be believable that nobody sees them blink because they're all too self-interested to stare at the kids in costumes for long enough. Nobody's talking to them. Sonic insists that the Overlanders are really whacked out and Knuckles agrees, and somehow they get disgusted at being offered fried chicken too. I know this is because they're animal people, but does anybody think that nobody eats chicken on Mobius? And that everyone's a vegan? I never did, because they always seem to eat the same food as everyone else. We're never told that everyone but the villains are vegans, so he could so easily not be reacting like this. I'd rather just enjoy the party like I'd imagine him to, like the cool hero he's supposed to be. Instead he's not acting like Sonic, so what's the point in him meeting these people? It doesn't make it memorable that Sonic and Knuckles met these characters if all they do is complain about something they wouldn't complain about, and all the humans do is compliment their costumes. They can't show off their abilities because that would attract too much attention. Sonic wisely lies that he hears Sabrina calling to try to make an excuse to get away from the humans. Sabrina's smart enough to not like that look in Reggie's eye. She never saw his eye because she's behind him, so she was speaking metaphorically. Anyways, she's still smart by being aware of the fact that he could be suspicious because he's aware that she's a witch and trying to prove it sometimes in the series. It's impressive that the writer knew that because Reggie hasn't been like this since the 70s, and yet he still thought Reggie and her would have this dynamic. Jughead says they're bobbing for comics instead of apples, even though comics would be damaged in water. And Sabrina says she has to call in the cavalry. Huh? She goes inside to find a phone and calls Salem. She says now's not the time to be his usual self. I like that. Salem says that he enjoys seeing her grovel, which is overly sinister since Salem at this point isn't evil. He was only turned into a cat because he didn't want to marry the evil head witch. It's like he based his personality on the sitcom instead, which is more familiar to more people. Sabrina tells him what happened, and Salem warps to Sabrina and asks where Sonic and Knuckles are. She asks what he's doing here and if he's lost his mind. He levitated a phone towards him in the 90s comic, so I already know he has powers. Then they see Robotnik and Sabrina says, "You brought him here too?" Salem says he has no idea how he got here. Hopefully this means that Robotnik tracked Sonic down here and used his own tech to warp here, because that makes sense. What doesn't make sense is Robotnik not turning around and seeing Sabrina and Salem the instant they talk behind him. He acts like they don't exist, instead of finding out about talking cats and realizing that Sabrina's probably a witch. For no reason, Sabrina wastes time telling Salem to get Robotnik back home instead of using magic on him herself, when there's not much time. So Knuckles and Sonic jump at Robotnik to attack him. Oh, never mind. It's just Jughead in a Robotnik costume. Okay, that's less contrived than Robotnik coming here, even if there was no indication that Jughead was a Sonic fan before. Salem wishes he was allowed to just send away boring humans instead. It gets pressured into sending Sonic and Knuckles home, which makes me sad because it means the crossover ended before I knew it. Salem explains that Sabrina made everyone forget about the magical events that happened. At least that's unusually smart of her. This Sonic crossover was by Ken Penders. I never thought I'd see a Sabrina story by him. Sabrina causes two magical things to happen by accident, which never makes sense. As if you didn't have to imagine the thing happening for it to happen from magic, how else would magic work? So her taking a guy with her to Mobius was contrived, when she could have easily gone there to meet Sonic because she's already a fan of his comics. Once she's there, Sonic and Knuckles don't trust her because she's human, and they don't trust Robotnik. Somehow, An all-powerful witch is scared of him to the point of wanting to leave Mobius right away from seeing Robotnik. All caught up in the fact that he's Robotnik in the flesh and threatened to turn Tails into a rug. So she doesn't turn him into a frog. She just remarks that they have no ASPCA on this planet instead of trying to punish someone she doesn't like with magic, like 70s Sabrina did impulsively all the time. Though Robotnik's more intimidating than everyone else she doesn't like. And Knuckles and Sonic shouldn't have been written to waste time talking to each other, because in all that time, you'd think Sabrina would have done something to Robotnik. Or at least warped home, if that's all she cares about right now. So there's no excuse for warping Sonic and Knuckles home with her, even if the idea was the teleportation smoke hit them. What's disappointing about the crossover is that the characters from the two different franchises barely have character interactions with the ones from the other franchise. It's not nearly enough, and it's not what you'd expect. Sonic never acts like Sonic other than hating Robotnik. He just assumes Sabrina and her friend are evil because they're humans and operates on an attack-first policy despite supposedly being a good guy who would notice that they're unarmed. Then he and Knuckles complain about any animal meat being served, even though Sonic eats chili dogs and Archie. And aside from Knuckles detecting that Sabrina's trouble, that's the full extent of their acknowledgement of the Sabrina franchise. They never act like themselves because they don't get the chance to. They never get to know that Sabrina's a good person because they're too conspicuous on Earth, and Shale just had to show up and be there to give them a ride to the party. So they couldn't have talked to Sabrina about their lives in front of her. They never bond with each other. But to be fair, there'd be no excuse for Sabrina not taking down Robotnik if they talked to each other more. Sonic and Knuckles were too focused on how they're away from home to think to tell her to fight Robotnik. They weren't with her long enough. I hope that makes sense. Instead, Sonic and Knuckles end up jumping on Jughead because it's an Eggman costume, which justifies them being warped home early. Because Sabrina is an omnipotent goddess who could take down Robotnik right away, it must have been a very difficult task to handle this kind of story. So I don't envy them for having to figure out how to write it. And it just barely worked. As I was too interested in talking about the story and progressing with it to ask why Sabrina didn't use magic on Robotnik until she was already leaving Mobius. Ultimately, I was really invested in this story because I loved seeing the Sonic characters in this period of Archie again. Just like I remembered it. So other than how Sonic and Knuckles acted, it wasn't bad. It was actually good, if underwhelming. It's better than how it could have been because it doesn't drag out too long and become boring and frustrating. But I wanted to see her take a tour of Knothole at least, which could have worked if she went there without knowing who Robotnik was. It's shocking that we never saw anyone explore it and finally show us a full map of the place and what it's like beyond a bunch of straw huts and an apple stand. She just stood in one place for a minute and saw Sonic insult Eggman, experiencing the bare minimum of Sonic. And we had to assume she was too caught up in being afraid of Robotnik to think to bother him. But it had to be that way because otherwise she'd beat Robotnik. This has to be a different universe from Archie Sonic's Prime Zone, because now that she knows she can come here, and she's had time to regain her composure, she'd go back here and turn Robotnik good or turn him into a frog. Betty67. Hilda tells Sabrina that it'd be a lot easier to hit the pins using magic. But there'd be no challenge in that. Sabrina's right that the mortal way develops your skills. Someone insults the ants, so he ends up flying to the pins. It's funny that someone looking like Reggie says, "That was the weirdest thing." It was like it just flew down the lane. Betty and Veronica 129. Hilda gets told good morning and politely sends it back when she's tired. Her hair roars and becomes really bad just because she's got magic in her. But that shouldn't last all day because she could point to turn it back to normal. It only lasts or happen at all if she had a witch sickness infecting her magic battery, so the infection would instantly return it to normal. Betty and Veronica's Spectacular 32. As usual, Hilda doesn't love camping. It's at least fresh that Zelda's camping, even if she's done that before. Hilda's mad at the idea of sleeping in a tent, but Sabrina doesn't consider this to be roughing it because the tent's magically better than their own house, with a pool and TV. How are they supposed to listen to the sounds of nature over the TV? Cheryl Blossom, 1997, 17. Sabrina sees an overdue book notice from the witch's library. because there's only one witch's library. Refreshingly, it's Zelda who has the overdue library book, which is nice because she's so stern in the later continuities. Predictably, it's over a century old. Hilda says that she's been meaning to take it back. Wait, for Zelda? How did the writer call her Zelda by mistake? Does even he realize that they have the same personality? The name of the book is A Guide to Becoming More Responsible. That was charming. Archie 479. Sabrina says the Totally Not Backstreet Boys put on a great concert, and Amy brags that she has a backstage pass to meet them. Sabrina magically creates one for herself, doing the smart thing. She also changes it so that Amy's backstage pass is for a different band she doesn't want to see. I like that Sabrina was smart and got away with giving Amy what's coming to her, and not having to put up with her. Betty 69. Sabrina's hair is wet, and she asks outside of the bathroom who took her hairdryer. Right away the story would never happen because she's a witch who uses magic casually on impulse, so she would just use magic to instantly summon a hairdryer. The story was just an excuse to show off the silly image of Salem all poofy, asking why everyone assumes that he took the hairdryer. I guess he liked its warm air. Betty and Veronica 131. Sabrina's happy that Harvey drew a sketch of her, and Hilda says it's romantic, appreciating it. She says her old boyfriend did a drawing of her too, and she can take her to it with magic. It's pitch black in there, so Sabrina apologizes and zaps up some light so that they can see. And there's a cave drawing of Hilda. Hilda's never been portrayed as thousands of years old before. Betty and Veronica Spectacular 1992-33. Sabrina complains that the senior boys never notice her, as if she'd rather date someone other than Harvey, and wants to look a little more mature. Salem suggests a spell in the magic book, making for a very predictable joke where she looks old. And he says amusingly, "The senior boys should notice you now." But he made it less funny when he said his next line because it explained the joke. She couldn't have made this mistake because she'd have to imagine herself as elderly to make herself look that way. So she'd only do it if she was reading out the spell and its wording made her think about herself as an old lady. But why would there even be a spell for something that no one would want? Betty and Veronica Summer Fun 6. Hilda tells Sabrina that she's taking a shot at some new brew recipe. She gives it to Sabrina, who thinks it needs some work, and it duplicates her, as she says a phrase I never heard before. Veronica 83. Salem calls someone to tell them, "I just wanted to call and tell you what a wonderful job you're doing." He says he's very proud of his service and says, "We just need more people out there like you." He was talking to the dog catcher. I especially liked that page.